Welcome to the West Ohio Conference Safe Sanctuaries Policy Review. My name is Rebecca Hugg.
And I'm Anne-Marie Carley.
And we are Safe Sanctuary trainers in the West Ohio Conference. Welcome to the online review of the West Ohio Conference Safe Sanctuaries Recommended Policies and Procedures. My name is Rebecca Hugg, and I am the Emerging Ministries Coordinator at the West Ohio Conference. This video will review the history and purpose of safe sanctuaries in the United Methodist Church and walk through the West Ohio Conference recommended policies and procedures. In 1996, the General Conference of the United Methodist Church adopted a resolution aimed at reducing the risk of abuse in local churches. In 2014, our West Ohio Annual Conference adopted a resolution requiring each congregation to establish a safe sanctuaries policy and to review that policy annually. 2 years later, in 2016, a Safe Sanctuaries Task Force was created in West Ohio to revise the recommended policies and procedures to reflect the deletion of mandatory language and replace it with recommendation language. And in 2019, the West Ohio Conference trained 20-plus faith leaders to serve in their districts as Safe Sanctuaries consultants and trainers. Safe Sanctuaries is an art of balancing risk reduction and ministry engagement in our churches. And as a denomination, we're still new at this. The West Ohio Conference has worked hard to make the adoption of a Safe Sanctuaries policy as simple and comprehensive as possible for your church. Let's walk through the purposes of having a Safe Sanctuaries policy at your local church. The purposes of developing and implementing Safe Sanctuaries policy is to 1. Prevent abuse from happening in our churches. 2. Be a place where children, youth, and vulnerable adults can feel safe in disclosing abuse. And 3. Protect the loyal volunteers and employees who minister to vulnerable populations. Why does it matter to talk about vulnerable populations? Let's talk about God's heart. God cares about the vulnerable among us. Jesus showed us how to care for the vulnerable among us, and we are entrusted with the continued care of God's creation, especially care of vulnerable populations. In Scripture, both New Testament and Hebrew Scriptures, we hear about orphans, widows, and foreigners as the vulnerable populations of the time. In James, we read, "Religion that is pure and undefiled before God is this, to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world." And in Deuteronomy, we read, "God ensures that orphans and widows receive justice. God shows love to the foreigners living among you and gives them food and clothing." While orphans, widows, and foreigners can still be considered vulnerable populations among us, we no longer live in biblical times, and the list of the vulnerable among us continues to grow. Vulnerable populations include minors, children and adolescents, vulnerable adults, people who may require a legal guardian, attorney, or supportive family or peer group to make decisions concerning their life and livelihood, persons with disabilities of all ages, refugees, migrants and immigrants, returning citizens, sisters and brothers returning to communities after serving time in prison, and people who have experienced complex trauma. During previous Safe Sanctuaries trainings, participants have also identified persons who are home insecure and living in poverty, and persons with mental illness as additional vulnerable populations. As you consider the context and culture of your own congregation and community, who are the vulnerable among you? Abuse often happens in places where vulnerable populations feel safe, like in homes, schools, camps, residential care settings, and even churches. People who have been abused may also feel more comfortable sharing what has happened to them in a loving environment, like your church. It is important that we know how to identify abuse. This next section, Anne-Marie will discuss different forms of abuse with examples. Please take any precautions necessary now to guard your heart and your head from being triggered negatively with this information.
Thanks, Rebecca. As noted, in this section, we will talk about the different forms of abuse with examples. Please take any precautions necessary to guard your heart and your mind as we go through this section. Abuse can take on many forms: physical, emotional, neglectful, sexual, and ritualistic abuse. Faith workers should be aware of and able to identify the various signs and symptoms that go with each of these forms of abuse. Physical abuse is deliberate and intentional bodily harm. Often, physical abuse results in bruises, burns, or cut marks, reports of pain, withdrawal from others, and difficulty navigating others' emotions or stressful situations. A typical sign of physical abuse is pulling back from being touched or being jumpy around others, especially in loud or stressful situations. As a previous children and youth pastor, I think about gathering times during our groups together, where everyone was coming together, hugging each other, and chatting. If I see someone who is constantly withdrawn during this time or pulling back from others' hugs or pats on the shoulder, I may pay closer attention to that student and check in with them about what makes gathering time so difficult, hoping that they would be willing to share with me what's going on so I can better assess for potential abuse. Another symptom of physical abuse can be harm towards or abuse of others. You've heard the phrase, hurt people hurt people. And often, physical abuse is something that is learned and repeated. Emotional abuse is often less visible than physical abuse and is the exposure to spoken and unspoken violence or cruelty. Emotional abuse often leaves someone feeling unwanted, invisible, or like a burden to others. We know that these thoughts and beliefs are not God's intention and that God tells us we are loved and there is a plan for our life. Other symptoms of emotional abuse may include silence, excessive apologizing, depression, and lack of eye contact. Neglect is the endangerment of the health, welfare, and safety of an individual through absence, avoidance, or lack of awareness of how to provide appropriate care. Symptoms of neglect often show up in lack of basic needs or inappropriate attire. Neglect may show up as consistent hunger or lack of food for events where bringing food is expected, having ripped, wrong-sized, or dirty clothing, or not dressing appropriate for the weather, difficulties with hygiene such as bad body odor, matted hair, or dry or ashy skin, and awkward social interactions which often include withdrawal from people and a lack of awareness of how to interact, an excessive amount of energy put forward to gain someone's attention, or a mix of two excessive attempts to get close, then dramatic shift to push away or withdraw. Sexual abuse, like physical abuse, may leave visible markings on the victim's body and, like emotional abuse, may cause silence and secrecy. Sexual abuse is contact of interaction with another for the purpose of sexual stimulation of the perpetrator or another person. Sexual abuse often involves a stage of priming the victim. Priming is the process of gaining the trust of the victim through giving gifts, playing on emotions, giving threats of harm to the victim of loved ones if they tell, and convincing the victim that the abuse is their fault or that they enjoy the abuse. Symptoms of sexual abuse can take many forms. Physically, there may be a presence of an infection, unexplained bruising or bleeding, or even pain. Behavioral symptoms may include bedwetting or soiling, avoidance of removing clothes to change or bathe, and expressing inappropriate sexual behaviors for the person's age or a vast difference from their previous presentation of self. Victims of sexual abuse may also speak often and uninhibitedly about sexual topics, may experience nightmares or flashbacks, express excessive worrying or fearfulness, and may revert to behaviors they'd previously grown out of. Ritualistic abuse is the last form we will cover. Ritual abuse is intentional, physical, sexual, or psychological violence inflicted by another person responsible for the victim's welfare. We've heard numerous stories of ritual abuse through churches, sports teams, the military, and more. The main difference that sets ritualistic abuse apart is that vulnerable persons are entrusted to another adult for that individual's development in some way. Let's recap. We've discussed 5 types of abuse: physical, emotional, neglect, sexual, and ritual. But what makes someone consider harming another person through abuse? Perpetrators of abuse often have these 5 things in common. 1. They are trusted by the victim. 2. They thrive on blending in, promoting secrecy and isolation, and use manipulation. 3. They exert power in order to control, harm, or exploit. 4. They intentionally seek positions of power or authority. 5. And they often have experienced abuse or neglect themselves or have a developmental or intellectual disability. Let's remember, people who are hurt tend to hurt others. In my experience, people who are perpetrators of violence have often grown up in households of violence or neglect. They don't know what a healthy or respectful relationship can look like, sound, or feel like, and may be scared of not having power or control. While abusive actions are never okay, it is important for us as faith workers to understand how people become abusers and what drives them to abuse others. It's also important for us as faith workers to identify symptoms and signs of abuse in those to whom we minister. Thank you for joining us for this brief overview of Safe Sanctuaries. For more information and resources, check out westohioumc.org/safesanctuaries.